mid to late 1990s is probably my favourite era of Formula 1. I don't know why that is, it's probably because that's when I started watching and getting interested in it. But looking back, the shapes of the cars might have something to do with it. They were simple. They were easy to draw when I was bored in class, and I suppose there was a lot of colour going on as well. Now, I'm not one to start whining that modern liveries aren't nice enough for me, because I'm not watching Formula 1 to go, ooh, that car's pretty, or getting excited because there's going to be a livery change for one race only. But those tobacco liveries really were something of the time, especially given that back then it was all analog TV and the picture quality wasn't great, so the more colourful they were, the more they stood out. There was no 4K back then, certainly no 1080. And when driving these older cars in racing sims, they've got enough downforce to keep them on the road, but they still lack some mechanical grip, so you still need to be careful when getting the power down. And I suppose I should mention this before somebody tells me that I forgot, there was the noise. 3.5 litre engines, which were shrunk down to 3 litre for 1995, that came in 8, 10 and 12 cylinder flavours. The actual racing left a lot to be desired, but they sounded good, and that makes everybody think that it was better back then. It really wasn't, but I've explained why so many times now. But it was all at a time where Formula 1 was expanding in ways that it had never done before. Television money was ramping up, sponsorship money was ramping up, and as a result, the budgets were ramping up. At the same time, some of the most brilliant minds in the sport were really starting to stretch their legs, like Ross Brawn and Adrian Newey. And while the greats from the 80s were starting to wind down their careers, the future looked bright, with stars of the future beginning to shine. Schumacher was looking like the most obvious star of the future, but there were other drivers floating around who would go on to have long and/or pretty successful careers by all accounts. Coulthard, Barrichello, Hakkinen, and so on. And at the end of the 1995 season is where I think modern Formula 1 truly began. Between 1985 and 1995, the Australian Grand Prix had been held in the city of Adelaide. Clive James called it one of Australia's great tourist attractions, and perhaps the most civilised and elegant cities in the Southern Hemisphere. A pretty, gentle place on the human scale, offering year-round peace, quiet, refined wines, and nothing noisier than a koala belching after an excess of gum tips. I'll have to take his word for that because, well, I find wine absolutely disgusting. But one thing that was noted about Adelaide is that it was a charming city that seemed to be the opposite of what a season finale should be. It seemed a bit too chilled out at times, like Vancouver. I mean, Vancouver's pretty chill. At least it was when I went. The riots after Boston winning the Stanley Cup excepted, of course. The circuit was in the Victoria Park area of the city. It had a bit of purpose-built track in the park itself, but once you left the park, you were out on the city streets. And when you zoom in on Google Earth, it's actually quite easy to see where the track went. Most of the corners are typical street circuit, 90 degrees, but there is a fast S-bend as the cars pass Rodney Park. The circuit used by the V8 supercars today branches off just before that S-bend, because in the time between Formula 1 leaving and now, there were changes made to the streets beyond that section of track, making racing on that particular part of the city streets unviable. There's also a fast right-hander that leads onto the main back straight, known as Brewery Corner. Now, Brewery Corner was the site of a massive smash in qualifying on Friday, this being at a time where Formula 1 had 2 one-hour sessions, one on Friday and one on Saturday. As Mika Hakkinen in the McLaren entered Brewery Bend, he lost control of the car, with the car spinning through 360 degrees and also giving the exit curb a good old whack at the same time. Hitting the curb caused the McLaren to get air, and because of this, there was no way of slowing the car down. So Mika went into the tyre wall on the exit of the corner at almost unabated speed. It's reckoned he went in at about 120 miles an hour. As Hakkinen hit the tyres, his head was thrown around in the incredibly open cockpit that Formula 1 cars had at that particular time, with the very low cockpit sides that just look weird today. As a result, the FIA would start looking into a hands device style system that went through many different iterations before they finally decided on the actual hands device. Hakkinen was lucky that he didn't suffer the same fatal injuries as Roland Ratzenberger did the year before. The impact was violent enough that he required an emergency tracheotomy at the side of the track, administered by 2 off-duty doctors who just happened to be watching at that point of the circuit. He'd also crashed in a very fortunate spot, if you want to call it that, because the Royal Adelaide Hospital was less than a mile from the crash site, As well as the FIA looking into a head retention device which went through several designs before they simply adopted the hands device that was being used in NASCAR and IndyCar, changes to the cockpits were also made in time for 1996, the most notable change being the raised cockpit sides that are still in use today. But Häkkönen's crash was just another piece of history written at this specific circuit. Even though Adelaide was a very chilled out place to be, the Adelaide Street Circuit liked to serve up some drama. Häkkönen's crash had come just a year after the collision between Damon Hill and Michael Schumacher the year before, at the end of a season that many just wanted out of the way and never spoken of again. In 1986, there was a three-way scrap for the title, with Piquet and Mansell the main contenders, only for Mansell's tyre to explode in spectacular fashion on the back straight between Brewery Corner and the famous hairpin, and somehow, out of all of it, the title going to Prost. In 1991, it was Formula One's shortest ever race until the 2021 Belgian Grand Prix overtook it, where it was rained off, with Mansell breaking his foot when he crashed out of that particular race. But after 10 years, this circuit would be hosting its final race, and this year, there was nothing to play for. Benetton and Schumacher were already the world champions. Williams had been embarrassed, and Hill might have still been reeling from the alleged professional foul the year before. Not only this, Hill had been thrust into the team leader position and didn't have the experience that other drivers had. One thing to remember here is that Hill was now 34 years old, but in only his third full F1 season. Schumacher was in his fourth, but he was only 26. To make my point stand out even more, Damon is a year younger than Martin Brundle, but Martin was entering his 10th Formula 1 season. And the year Brundle started in Formula 1 was the year that Damon started car racing. Not like Formula 1 racing or anything like that, car racing in general. So when people have their cracks at Damon, it helps to consider these facts. He was older than most of the other drivers, and way less experienced. But the fact does remain that Williams had been done over good and proper this season by the metronomic Benetton and its star driver. So much so that behind the scenes, Frank Williams had put pen to paper with a 2-year deal for Sauber prospect Heinz-Harald Frentzen that would begin in 1997. Something that Damon would not find out about until the latter part of 1996. And Damon had also attracted a lot of criticism from the public, the press, and even his biggest supporters. His super late entry into the sport and his lack of experience compared to others might have contributed to the subpar 1995. Again, it's mental to think that by the end of 1995, Damon and Rubens Barrichello had the same amount of F1 experience. But Rubens is 12 years younger. This excluding Damon's short-lived career with Brabham in 1992, obviously. So this was to be a dead rubber race. There wasn't much to play for other than some drivers getting some potential extra points in the standings and teams fighting over the scraps in the lower part of the constructors. But as mentioned earlier, this race was the end of one chapter and the start of so many others. Firstly, this was the last race at Adelaide, and it would move to Australia's sporting capital of Melbourne for 1996, which in itself would become a popular place for fans. As a result, a record attendance would be seen at this race weekend, as 200,000 people packed into the stands to watch the last ever F1 race on the streets of Adelaide, and that record would stand until the first F1 race at Indianapolis in 2000. That's pretty much it for the location, but other chapters were beginning elsewhere. Schumacher was going to leave his safety net at Benetton after this Grand Prix to move to Ferrari, a move that many at the time treated like another future 7-time champions move from McLaren to Mercedes. Ferrari was in its banter years, so why the hell would Michael leave Benetton and go to Ferrari? That team of Briatore, Simmons, Brawn, Walkinshaw and the others had seen Benetton go from the team owned by the people that make those jumpers to world champions. And now Schumacher, Brawn and a few others were going to leave. But it wasn't just Schumacher leaving, Johnny Herbert would be leaving too, for Sauber. And Johnny wasn't going to shed any tears because his time as Michael's teammate had been a hard old slog. David Coulthard meanwhile was moving to McLaren, which meant that 2 long relationships with the team would begin in 1996, albeit one more successful than the other. And it would also be the last time a V12 was run competitively. From here on, it would be a V8 or a V10, with it becoming V10 exclusive from 1998 up until the end of 2005. Coulthard was moving on mostly for the money, as he admitted in his book, but he felt that he wasn't properly wanted at Williams, given the circumstances that gave him that seat in the first place. He'd also made quite a few errors in 1995, but given how 1996 would go, did Coulthard actually end up throwing away a title chance? It was also going to be the last race for Pacific as well. The money issues had piled up and Oliver Gavin was supposed to be drafted in to do this final race, Gavin was denied a super license by the FIA, so Pacific shareholder Bertrand Gachot was called in to do it instead. And plans were to merge with the old Lotus team for 1996, but nothing came of it. It would leave Forti and Minardi squabbling for the wooden spoon, and with the 107% rule coming in for the first round of 1996, it meant that the days of these underfunded privateers were pretty much over. But in the run-up to the Grand Prix, the already mentioned Clive James managed to score some interviews with Damon and the Michael, and the documentary he made while a guest of Eddie Jordan is, well, probably on the internet somewhere. During this documentary, he managed to get Schumacher to open up from his focused, borderline arrogant self, and said that he found Michael no more arrogant than William Wordsworth being interviewed about a host of golden daffodils. He also managed to get Damon and Michael to be interviewed at the same time, where the pair admitted that they respected each other but weren't friends. Michael was asked if they ever had a laugh together, and Michael said, "I think we did, yeah, but I don't remember it." They also admitted that their only knowledge of each other came from what the press was saying about the other guy. A Motorsport magazine said back in 2020 that this was probably the reason that the two drivers never really understood each other, because they never actually talked to each other. They based their opinions on each other with what the press was saying about the opposite guy. So the British press about Michael and the German press about Damon. But the thing is, Michael and Damon were two completely different men going about things in a completely different way. Damon already had a wife and son, and had the wife and son before he even entered Formula 1, and he also understood that there was a life away from the sport. I mean, his dad was a Formula 1 driver, so he kind of understood how to balance the work and life and everything else. But Michael's life was Formula 1. There was nothing else. But the Williams cars were pretty quick in qualifying when it came round to it. Hill beat Coulthard to the pole spot by just over a tenth, with the Michael in third. The two Ferraris were behind in 4th and 5th, with Frentzen, Barrichello, Herbert, Irvine and Blundell rounding out the top 10. Only 22 of the 24 qualifiers would start the race. Hakkinen didn't take the start because he was in the hospital, and Luca Badoer's Minardi didn't start because of an electrical issue. At the start, Coulthard beat Hill off the line and led into the Senna chicane at the start of the lap. And looking at the circuit in those days, is it any wonder that they dropped the circuit? The V8 supercars struggled to get through there, so what chance has a modern Formula 1 car got? But Hill wasn't the only one slow off the line, because Berger had got his Ferrari into third, and Alesi also managed to get past Schumacher. And ironically, those two would be in that Benetton next season. Schumacher would be back into fourth by the end of that lap, with Berger losing his position a few laps later. And as a measure of how mental things were back then, on the formation lap for this race, a man with a TV camera stood in the middle of the track and the cars filtered past him. Imagine if somebody didn't get the message. Coulthard had a 1.5 second lead by the end of the first lap. He'd also taken Hill around the outside of that opening chicane, which was pretty brave. Further back though, the other story of this Grand Prix was developing, and that was the attrition. If you thought that Spa 1998 was bad, this was as bad, but at least this was taking place on a much drier day. One of the Pacifics, that being the car of Montemini, had a gearbox failure on lap 2, while Carl Wendlinger's F1 career ended on lap 8 when he pulled out, citing his inability to withstand the physical nature of Formula 1 following that near-fatal crash at Monaco in 1994. The gap between the two Williams cars stabilised at around 1.5 seconds, but further back, after just 4 laps, the gap from the Williams cars to that Schumacher and Berger battle was around 7 seconds, which is incredible even for this time frame. Over the next few laps, more drivers started to drop. Taki Inui spun off on lap 15, but it was Coulthard who was going to be left red-faced when he crashed in the pit lane as he came in for his stop on lap 20. He'd simply come in too hot and there wasn't enough grip on the pit entry, so he just slid into the barrier. It's not how he would have wanted his Williams career to end, and had the car stayed in one piece for the rest of the Grand Prix, there's every possibility he could have won the race. This promoted the Michael into the lead as Damon had already made his stop and the Benetton was going a little bit longer. The gap between the Williams and the Benetton was around 1.5 seconds as the camera cut away to show Barrichello in the Jordan going off and into a tyre wall. Schumacher pitted that same lap and merged back out onto the track inches from the back of the Ferrari of Alesi. And then at the hairpin, they crashed. Alesi crashed into him in a straight line. I don't know how exactly it all happened because there's limited views of the accident, but from looking at it, it looks like Alesi was trying to do a switchback and just misjudged the length of the Benetton. Pedro Lamy then spun and spun again, trying to get the car pointing the right way. He made a right porridge of it, said Murray Walker, and Schumacher pulled into the pits to get his car seen to and Alesi to retire. All this happening as Roberto Moreno locked his rear brakes on entry into the pit lane and spun through 180 degrees, breaking the rear axle. But the entry to the pit lane was proving troublesome, because Johnny Herbert and the other Benetton did exactly the same thing Coulthard did, but somehow managed to avoid the wall. It was later mentioned that Coulthard's car simply did not want to stop, like there was no engine braking or anything like that, and it was that caused the impact. But since Coulthard wasn't the only one having issues with pit entry, then that must have taken some weight off his shoulders, although convincing Patrick and Frank would have been a bit trickier. A little bit later on, Berger's engine blew up, while Hill managed to keep the lead after a 22-second pit stop. Frentzen would then inherit second with Berger now out, but his gearbox packed in, which allowed Herbert to take second, nullifying his pit lane entry problems. Herbert would have finished third in the championship if he made the end of the Grand Prix, but his drive shaft went. So Irvine was now promoted into third, but he lost pneumatic pressure. Now, it was Olivier Panis in the Ligier who was running in second. Panis was a full lap behind race leader Damon Hill. The next car back was Gianni Morbidelli in the footwork, who was 3 laps behind the Williams. But Panis was having issues of his own. His Ligier was dumping oil all over the track and slowing down. Hill, meanwhile, was the only one of the top drivers not having issues and was continuing on as normal, while Panis was driving slower than normal and maintaining that 1 lap gap to Morbidelli's footwork. Hill's superior car and pace allowed him to lap Panis again in the closing stages, and would end up winning the race by 2 full laps. The first time since the Spanish Grand Prix of 1969 that a driver had lapped the entire field. And nobody has done it since. So Hill was the only driver to complete the full race distance of 81 laps. Panis, Morbidelli and Blundell ended up on the same lap come the end, with Salo taking 5th place for Tyrrell and Pedro Lamy scoring a rare point for Minardi. Diniz finished 7th, which was 40's best ever result, even if back then no points were given for 7th, with Gasho in the Pacific being the last of the finishers. 5 laps down. Everybody else failed to finish. Considering that there was nothing on the line and this was the last race at Adelaide, it had served up one final piece of Formula 1 history. Looking at the full broadcast, Morbidelli was just 8 or 9 seconds behind Panis right at the end, and Hill lapped Panis with just 1 lap to go. It also allowed Damon to silence his critics. It also allowed him to get a boost of confidence to take into the winter as Williams started preparing for the 1996 season. With Ferrari still looking off the pace, even with Schumacher, and Benetton having an all-new look about them for the following year, Hill was most definitely the title favourite for 1996. The thing is, could Williams put behind them their strategy blunders and moments of head loss? Because you can have the best car, but you can still screw it up. And what's funny about this is, Damon ended up winning this race and then the first race of 1996 in Melbourne, which means he's the only person to win 2 Grand Prix in the same country in a row. And he won both of those races after having his car absolutely covered in somebody else's oil. Panis on this occasion, and then teammate Villeneuve in Melbourne. Now before I get piled on by people saying, but Schumacher won at Aida and Suzuka in 1995, one of those races was the Pacific Grand Prix, the other the Japanese Grand Prix. This was Australia and Australia. When it comes to this kind of train spotting, details matter. And at some point I do need to do a video on the Williams FW18 that won the championship in 1996, because it's my favourite ever Formula 1 car, but I don't know how unbiased I'll be. But either way, the last race at Adelaide managed to serve up one last piece of history before it was lost forever. So then a look at the 1995 Australian Grand Prix, the final race at the Adelaide Street Circuit. If this has been interesting for you, then do give the video a like so I know a good job was done, and for more stuff from the channel, get subscribed and also get the bell on so you never miss out on anything else that I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the mad lads over at Patreon who continue to support me at a more personal level, and if you want to help out with image purchases or just keeping things running around here, a link to Patreon will be in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates and anything else you might want or need to know. Well, there's super thanks for any one and done donations and memberships so you can do Patreon without the Patreon. So until next time, I've been Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.